June 6, 1944. The beaches of Normandy burn beneath a hail of bullets and blood. Allied soldiers crawl across the sand, their bodies trembling under the scream of artillery. The tide turns red. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler stands over a map, his generals begging for orders. But he hesitates. Somewhere deep inside his bunker, a message lies open on his desk, a report from one of his most trusted spies. The invasion, it says, is only a decoy. The real attack will come at Calais. Hitler believes it. And so, the reinforcements never come. Thousands of miles away, in a quiet Lisbon apartment, a man sits alone at a wooden desk. No gun, no uniform. Just a pen, a pile of letters, and a mind sharper than any weapon of war. His name is Juan Pujol García, codename Garbo. As the world tears itself apart, he crafts a story so convincing that it bends the course of history. Every lie he writes is another life saved, and another risk taken. Outside, the war rages on. Inside, he dips his pen in ink, the scratching sound almost like the ticking of a bomb. Each letter he sends weaves a tapestry of deceit, one that fools both sides, the Germans who trust him, and the British who secretly control him. He never held a rifle, never spilled blood on the battlefield. Yet through lies alone, he shaped the fate of nations. He fought a war built on lies, and both sides believed him. The war had divided the world, but before it ever reached the beaches of Normandy, it had already divided Juan Pujol García. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a politician. He was an ordinary man, born in Barcelona, a hotel manager, a chicken farmer, a dreamer with an unshakable belief in truth and decency. But truth had died in Spain long before the world went to war. He had seen fascism crush the weak, communism betray the idealists, and good men slaughtered under flags they didn't believe in. By the time the Spanish Civil War ended, Juan Pujol had made a quiet vow. He would never again fight for a tyrant. But he would fight against one, in his own way. When World War II erupted, he saw the darkness spreading again, Hitler's rise, Europe burning, freedom gasping for breath. Pujol knew he couldn't just stand aside. He wanted to help Britain, the one country that still seemed to stand for something pure. He traveled across borders, carrying nothing but conviction and a stubborn hope that he could make a difference. When he finally reached British intelligence, he offered his services. He promised to spy on the Nazis, to risk his life for their cause. They turned him away. He wasn't trained. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't anyone. To them, he was just a Spaniard with wild dreams and no experience. That rejection should have ended his story. Instead, Pujol walked out of that embassy with a new idea burning in his mind. If the British wouldn't let him be a spy, he would simply make himself one. He didn't need permission. He needed imagination. And he had plenty of that. He began in neutral Lisbon, a city thick with whispers. Spies from every nation crowded its cafes, trading secrets over cups of bitter coffee. Pujol watched, listened, learned. He had no contacts, no resources, not even a typewriter. But what he did have was nerve. He decided to approach the Germans instead. He told them he wanted to spy for them in Britain, a Spanish patriot, loyal to the Axis cause. The Germans believed him. They handed him invisible ink, cash, and a code name, Arabelle. They expected reports from London, updates about troop movements, naval operations, and morale, but Pujol had never even set foot in Britain. That didn't stop him. With nothing more than a few outdated newspapers, travel brochures, and a mind wired for invention, he built an entire world out of thin air. He began sending detailed letters to the Abwehr, each one filled with intelligence, fake soldiers' names, fake ships, fake convoys, fake conversations overheard in pubs that didn't exist. He even described the weather in London by checking reports from Lisbon's English library. It worked. His letters were so rich with local detail that German intelligence was convinced. They had a man deep inside the British war machine. Soon, the Abwehr wanted more. They asked him to recruit others, so Pujol did. In his imagination, he created 27 agents, each with a name, a backstory, and a purpose. There was a Welsh nationalist, a Venezuelan courier, a British soldier stationed in Glasgow, even a woman working as a typist in the Air Ministry. Each agent had their own reports, which Pujol wrote himself, varying handwriting, different styles, and even invented travel delays between agents so messages appeared authentic. He tracked every fictional person in a notebook, drawing diagrams to keep their lives consistent. When one agent fell silent for too long, he'd write to the Germans, explaining that the poor man had died of pneumonia or been captured. The Abwehr mourned them and even paid pensions to their grieving. Families that never existed. What began as a desperate bluff was turning into one of the most elaborate illusions in the history of espionage. He wasn't just lying to the Nazis. He was performing for them, feeding them a world so believable that they stopped questioning it. The Germans began to rely on him, sending larger sums of money to fund his network. He kept the cash, but never spent it. To him, this wasn't greed. It was justice. Every lie was a strike against tyranny. Still, each letter he sent carried risk. If they discovered his deception, he'd be executed, not as a spy, but as a fraud. Yet Pujol seemed almost amused by the danger. When one German officer asked him for proof that he was in London, he calmly replied that travel had become difficult due to wartime petrol shortages. Then, in his next letter, he casually mentioned that he'd seen bomb damage in central London, a fact he learned from a week-old British newspaper. The Germans swallowed it whole. The irony was poetic. A man who had never seen London was now shaping how the Nazis viewed it. But beneath the humor and brilliance, there was loneliness. His wife, Araceli, worried about the risks. Friends called him delusional, but Pujol didn't stop. He believed that every fake message, every invented report, might save a life somewhere, a life that would never know his name. Months later, his operation was so convincing that even the British began hearing about the mysterious German spy in London. When MI5 investigated, they discovered the truth and were stunned. The man they had rejected had created an entire fictional intelligence empire under their noses. The British didn't just recruit him after that. They gave him a new identity. From Arabelle, the German agent, he became Garbo, the British double agent. Juan Pujol García had succeeded in the impossible. He had become the world's first self-made spy, a man without a gun, without orders, fighting a war of deception with nothing but imagination and conviction. And somewhere in Germany, generals were reading his latest report, nodding in satisfaction, completely unaware that every word they trusted was a lie. The phantom was born. In espionage, trust is the rarest currency. By the time 1942 arrived, Juan Pujol García had become rich in it, at least in the eyes of the Germans. To them, he was Agent Arabelle, a loyal spy in London who risked his life daily to deliver precious intelligence about Allied movements. They sent him invisible ink, radio codes, and money to pay his network. In Berlin, the Abwehr began quoting his reports in strategy briefings. His words written in a small Lisbon apartment by a man who'd never seen London, were shaping Nazi perception of the war. But Garbo, as MI5 would soon call him, wasn't satisfied. He hadn't come this far to simply fool one side. He wanted to help the Allies win. After months of playing Arabelle for the Germans, he sent another letter to British intelligence. This time it wasn't the rambling plea of a volunteer, it was evidence of a miracle. He brought documentation, proof of his German handler's trust, and even copies of his own forged intelligence reports. MI5 analysts read them with disbelief. How could a civilian in Lisbon have built an entire spy network that fooled the Abwehr? Within weeks, he was summoned to London under the strictest secrecy. A new identity awaited him, Double Agent Garbo. The name was chosen after Greta Garbo, the film star known for her ability to transform herself into anyone. It was fitting. Juan Pujol had turned himself into a character the world could never quite pin down. Once inside MI5's secret headquarters, Garbo's operation grew beyond imagination. With British guidance, his fictional agents became more detailed, more intricate, and more alive. They weren't just names anymore. They had histories, habits, and human flaws. There was Mr. Gerbers, a dock worker in Liverpool who passed shipping schedules to the Germans. Rags, a former sailor turned drunkard who gathered gossip from bars. A Scottish airman stationed near Glasgow who secretly despised the war but still fed intel to Garbo. Each had a salary, an address, and a file in MI5's vault, complete with forged handwriting samples. Garbo managed it all, 27 lives swirling in his mind like pieces on a chessboard. He recorded their reports by hand, crafted their voices, and made sure each piece of false information matched real events just enough to appear credible. When German agents sent follow-up questions, Garbo replied in their individual styles, curt, emotional, analytical, depending on the character. But now, the stakes were higher than ever. The Germans were listening, but so were the British. MI5 monitored every message, ensuring his lies served a purpose. Garbo stood at the center of a storm of deception, balancing two powers, each capable of killing him if he slipped late at night. Under blackout curtains, he wrote for hours by candlelight, dictating reports that blurred the line between fiction and truth. Convoy 47 leaving Liverpool under fog, one note might say, deliberately timed to coincide with a real ship departing days later. The Abwehr cross-checked his intelligence with actual naval losses, and every time coincidence smiled on him, their faith deepened. His brilliance lay in imperfection. He knew that perfect intelligence would raise suspicion, so he sprinkled his reports with small errors, delays, and contradictions. If a ship he mentioned was sunk, he'd apologize for missing its departure. If a bombing failed, he'd claim his agent had been detained. The Germans admired his honesty. They began calling him their most reliable source in Britain. To them, Arabelle was a hero. To the British, Garbo was an asset beyond value. To himself, he was neither. He was a man walking a tightrope across a pit of fire, juggling lies that could explode if they ever collided. The tension gnawed at him. Every new message required delicate calculation. Too much truth, and he might expose Allied operations. Too much falsehood, and the Germans might suspect betrayal. He walked a razor's edge, knowing one mistake could destroy everything. There were close calls. Once the Germans requested Garbo meet a U-boat crew off the coast of Portugal to exchange intelligence. He panicked. A face-to-face meeting would ruin him. MI5 intervened, fabricating a letter from one of his imaginary sub-agents explaining that the plan was impossible due to Allied patrols. The Germans apologized for asking. Another time, one of his agents, an imaginary courier named Samuel, was reported missing. Garbo had forgotten to account for him in a previous transmission. When his German handlers demanded an update, Garbo improvised. Samuel had been killed during a blackout while crossing the Thames. To make the lie convincing, he even wrote a letter from Samuel's widow, expressing grief and gratitude for the pension payments. The Abwehr believed every word. With each successful deception, Garbo's confidence grew, but so did the paranoia. He was living in a house built entirely of mirrors, every reflection another version of himself. Sometimes he forgot which side he was truly working for. The British treated him as a genius, yet watched him like a hawk. The Germans praised him as a hero, yet demanded results. His greatest weapon was patience. Garbo understood that information had to move at a believable pace. He carefully designed delays, reports sent days late, excuses made believable by wartime disruption. The illusion worked so well that when the Germans complained about missed communications, Garbo claimed his radio operator was ill. MI5 loved it. They even joked that Garbo's imaginary operator was the most unreliable man in the service. But humor couldn't mask the pressure. Every day, Garbo's web grew more complex, and with it, the danger. His family, now relocated to Britain, lived under assumed names. He slept little, ate less, and kept meticulous notebooks filled with cross-references between his real and fake lives. In one chilling entry he wrote, "To lie perfectly is to live between truths. To survive, one must forget which world is real." By 1943, his deception had become so deeply rooted in the German intelligence system that the Abwehr began forwarding his information directly to Hitler's headquarters. The Führer himself was reading Garbo's reports. Every word he wrote now carried the weight of life and death. His lies weren't just clever, they were lethal. He could make the enemy move armies or hold them back with a single transmission. And yet, beneath the brilliance there was fear, an ever-growing awareness that one day one side would discover the truth. Still, he continued, because for Garbo, this was more than espionage. It was a mission, a one-man war fought not with bullets, but with imagination. The world was beginning to shift toward its most decisive moment. Armies were gathering, plans were forming, and the fate of millions would soon hang on whether one man's lies could still be believed. Garbo sharpened his pen, looked at the clock, and began to write again. By early 1944, the war had reached its most critical point. Europe was burning, and the Allies were preparing for an invasion that could change the course of history, Operation Overlord. But before a single soldier stepped onto the beaches of Normandy, another quieter operation was already in motion. It wasn't fought with guns or tanks, but with whispers, radio signals, and letters. A war of illusion. Its name was Operation Fortitude. At the heart of it stood one man, the phantom Britain had built from lies. Agent Garbo. Inside a dimly lit MI5 office in London, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and tension. Maps stretched across the walls, marked with red and blue pins. The question that haunted the Allied command was simple: how to fool Hitler into defending the wrong coast. The answer lay in deception, and in Garbo's pen. The Allies had a plan: convince the Germans that the real invasion would land not in Normandy, but at Pas de Calais, the narrowest point between Britain and France. To pull it off, every false clue had to feel real. Troop build-ups, radio chatter, fake divisions, even inflatable tanks parked across southern England. But all those illusions needed one thing: credibility. They needed someone Hitler already trusted. That someone was Garbo. His reports had reached the highest circles of German command. They believed every word he wrote. His network of 27 agents had become a ghost army inside Britain, and the Abwehr depended on them. If Garbo said Calais was the target, the Führer would believe it. And so, the world's most dangerous lie was born. In the weeks leading up to D-Day, Garbo crafted messages that blended fact and fiction with surgical precision. He spoke of imaginary divisions gathering in southeast England, of General Patton leading a massive force waiting for the perfect weather to cross the Channel. He sent shipping manifests, coordinates, and reports of new landing crafts, all real enough to be impossible to dismiss. Each report had to arrive at exactly the right time. Too early and suspicion might grow. Too late, and the Germans might discover the truth before the beaches were stormed. Garbo and his MI5 handlers timed transmissions down to the hour. Every word he sent across the airwaves carried the weight of thousands of lives. On the night of June 5, 1944, he transmitted his most important message yet, one that would echo through history. He warned his German handler that a large Allied force was preparing to cross the Channel. The information was accurate enough to be credible, but intentionally late enough to ensure the Germans couldn't respond in time. He described decoy ships, faint landings, and even the sound of planes overhead. Then, as the first Allied troops began to approach Normandy, he added one more crucial detail. The real invasion, he said, would strike Calais in a matter of days. Normandy, he assured them, was just a distraction. The trap was set. As dawn broke on June 6th, the world erupted. The sky over Normandy filled with thunder, not from storms but from gunfire. Allied soldiers leapt from landing craft into chaos, into water thick with mud and blood. Many never made it past the waves. Others crawled forward through the smoke, clutching their rifles, praying the next explosion wouldn't find them. In Berlin, news of the landings reached Hitler's bunker. His generals demanded permission to deploy the panzer divisions stationed near Calais, the reinforcements that could crush the invasion before it took hold. But Hitler hesitated. He had read Garbo's latest report. The Normandy attack, he believed, was merely a ruse. The real assault would come at Calais, so he waited. For 48 crucial hours, the most powerful army in Europe stood still, frozen by a lie written in ink. Garbo watched from London as the reports came in. Casualty lists, weather updates, successes and failures. He knew his deception had bought time, but at a price. Thousands of men were dying on those beaches. Every minute he delayed German reinforcements, Allied soldiers bled for his lie. He couldn't look away. In one message, his MI5 handler noted the German hesitation. Garbo read it twice, hands trembling slightly. His lie was working. The Germans were convinced. Hitler himself was waiting for confirmation from Arabelle, his trusted spy in London, before making any move. Garbo's eyes burned as he stared at the radio console. He wanted to feel triumph, but all he felt was the weight of it. The crushing realization that words could kill as surely as bullets. When the smoke cleared, the beaches of Normandy were littered with the cost of victory. Bodies lay tangled in wire and surf. The sea had turned red, yet behind that horror, behind every death and every breath of the living, stood the silent work of deception. Because Garbo's reports had convinced the German High Command that the main invasion had not yet begun, Hitler refused to release the divisions guarding Calais for nearly 2 weeks. That decision changed everything. The Allies secured their beachheads, advanced inland, and began the liberation of Europe. The greatest amphibious invasion in history had succeeded, not only because of courage on the sand, but because of lies sent through the air. Still, Garbo couldn't celebrate. He walked alone through London that night, the sound of distant sirens echoing in the dark. The city was alive with cautious hope. People danced in the streets, unaware that their victory had depended on a Spaniard who had deceived both enemy and ally alike. He stopped beneath a streetlight, staring at his reflection in a shop window. For a moment he didn't recognize the man staring back. Who was he now, hero or manipulator?
Savior or liar?
He had never fired a shot, but his lies had done what entire armies couldn't. He had outwitted the Third Reich. He had saved countless lives by convincing the enemy to stand still. And yet he couldn't escape the quiet horror that came with knowing his greatest act of good had been built entirely on deceit. In a letter written years later, he confessed, "I fought my war with lies, and won. But victory never feels pure when it's built on shadows." For now, though, there was no time for reflection. The war was far from over. The Germans were retreating but not broken. The Allies pressed forward, the world shifting toward its final, brutal chapter. And somewhere in Berlin, in a dim office filled with confusion and disbelief, German intelligence officers pored over Garbo's transmissions, trying to understand how they had been so wrong. They didn't know that their most trusted agent was working for the enemy. They didn't know that their faith in him had helped seal their defeat. As Garbo returned home from MI5 headquarters, the morning light crept through the fog. London was quiet again. He poured himself a cup of coffee, the same way he had on the day it all began. The war still raged, but his part, the invisible, silent war of deception, had already shaped its outcome. He glanced at the radio, then at the papers spread across his desk. The ink had barely dried, but its consequences were already written in history. Garbo leaned back, his face half in shadow. Outside, the city began to stir. Inside, the man who had fooled Hitler closed his eyes for a moment, not to rest, but to listen. Somewhere far across the channel, men were still fighting and dying under skies his lies had cleared. He whispered to himself, "If truth is the first casualty of war, then perhaps lies can save it." For once there was no reply, just the hum of the radio and the distant echo of the sea. In the aftermath of D-Day, the ripples of Garbo's deception spread through Europe like a shockwave. The Allies had gained their foothold in France, and the Germans were scrambling to make sense of their catastrophic misjudgment. But inside Berlin, no one suspected that the man who had fed them their most trusted intelligence, Agent Arabelle, had been the very architect of their defeat. In fact, they were about to reward him. A coded message arrived for Garbo from his German handler, filled with congratulations and gratitude. His information, they said, had been invaluable. For his bravery, his dedication, and his loyal service to the Reich, the Führer himself had approved the Iron Cross, one of Nazi Germany's highest military honors. Garbo read the message in silence, the words sinking into him like a slow poison. He had fooled the most paranoid regime in history, not through violence, but through stories. Yet the irony of the moment was suffocating. The same hand that signed orders for massacres and exterminations was now pinning a medal on a man working for the Allies. At MI5 headquarters, the news spread quickly. The British handlers laughed in disbelief. "You've done the impossible," one of them said. "You've fooled Hitler." Garbo didn't laugh. A few months later, King George VI awarded him the Member of the Order of the British Empire, MBE, for his service to the Allied cause. 2 medals, 2 nations, 2 lies. Garbo smiled for the cameras that weren't there. There could be no public recognition, not yet. His name, his face, even his existence remained classified. The world would never know the man who had tricked the Third Reich into hesitating when it mattered most. But as he stared at the medals, one representing truth and the other falsehood, he realized they were indistinguishable. Both rewards for deceit, both forged from illusion. Each day that followed became harder. The war dragged on, and so did his deception. He continued to send coded transmissions to Berlin, reporting on agents who no longer existed. When one of his imaginary operatives fell ill, Garbo sent a telegram of condolences to German command, explaining that the man had died heroically during an air raid. The Abwehr, ever dutiful, arranged to send his family a pension. Every false report tightened the web of his own making. It had started as a mission to save lives, but now it was something darker, an endless performance he could never step off of. Sometimes, late at night, he would reread the messages he'd sent, searching for himself among the lies. There was nothing. No Juan Pujol, no Arabelle, no Garbo, only voices and stories that had grown larger than him. The British monitored every communication he made. The Germans trusted every word he sent. Neither truly knew who he was. He was no longer a man. He was a myth. And myths can't rest. As 1944 waned, the war turned against Germany. The Allied forces pushed toward Paris, then Berlin. The Nazis grew desperate, demanding faster, more specific intelligence. "Where are the new divisions forming?" they asked. "What are the Allies planning next?" Garbo responded with careful precision, mixing small truths among grand falsehoods. He described imaginary regiments being prepared for further invasions, false troop withdrawals, fake sabotage missions. His radio crackled with the sounds of war, distant gunfire, static, coded whispers. Each message was a step deeper into madness. The British praised him, but they also worried. MI5 noted changes in his behavior, long silences, erratic sleep, quiet staring fits that lasted for hours. When questioned, he brushed it off. "It's nothing," he said. "Just the noise of too many lives in my head." And indeed, there were many lives, 27 fictional agents, each still alive in German records. Some had died noble deaths. Others continued to report through Garbo, their voices sustained by his pen. To keep the illusion intact, he wrote letters in their handwriting, complete with ink smudges and worn paper, as though passed between spies in the shadows of wartime Britain. It was a theater of ghosts. But with every success came another layer of guilt. The Allies cheered his brilliance, yet he couldn't escape the faces of the soldiers who died on the beaches his lies had helped shape. He told himself it was worth it. that every deception had saved lives in the long run, but the line between savior and manipulator blurred a little more each day. He wrote in his journal, "Truth is too pure for war. To preserve it, we must stain it with lies." The strain began to show. He became paranoid that both sides might discover his double game. He asked MI5 if the Germans might ever suspect. His handler assured him they wouldn't, not after the Iron Cross, but Garbo knew better. Every spy lives with a ticking clock, and his was getting louder. He began to hear phantom voices, the imagined agents he'd created, speaking to him as though real. At times, he found himself arguing aloud with them, defending their missions, reminding himself they were fiction. The line between creation and reality dissolved, and yet the mission continued. Until the very end of the war, Garbo maintained his deception flawlessly. The Germans remained convinced he was their man in London, even as Allied forces closed in on Berlin. His messages kept their intelligence services guessing. Then, silence. May 1945. The war was over. Germany had fallen. The world celebrated. Garbo sat alone in a London apartment, the radio broadcasting victory parades outside. He should have felt relief. Instead, there was only emptiness. The lies had finally served their purpose, but without them, who was he? The British no longer needed him. The Germans would soon discover the truth. The myth of Arabelle had outlived its usefulness, and the man behind it was vanishing beneath its weight. He looked at the two medals on his desk, the Iron Cross and the MBE, one for loyalty to Hitler, one for loyalty to the king, both earned through deception. He laughed, softly, bitterly, the sound echoing in the silence of his room. "I am loyal," he whispered. But to what? In that moment, he understood that he belonged to neither side. The lies that had saved the world had also exiled him from it. He could never return to Spain. He could never live freely under his own name. He had betrayed everyone, and yet somehow no one. The war had given him purpose. Peace had taken it away. Garbo closed his journal that night and looked out the window at the dark, rain-slick streets of London. In the glass, he saw his reflection staring back, but it wasn't his face anymore. It was the mask he'd worn for years, the spy who didn't exist. He realized then that the war hadn't just been about nations and armies. It had been about truth and how easily it could be rewritten. He was a man who'd built an empire of lies so powerful it had changed the course of history. But now the empire was crumbling, and there was nowhere left to hide. He had become what every spy fears most, a shadow caught between two worlds, a man without a country, without truth. Only shadows. The war ended, but for Juan Pujol García, the man who had deceived the Nazis and the Allies alike, there was no victory parade, no triumphant homecoming. Only silence. The noise of war had faded, replaced by a void that echoed louder than any explosion. He had done what no other man had ever done, built an empire of lies so powerful it changed the course of history. His reports had convinced Hitler that the invasion at Normandy was a ruse, and because of that, German reinforcements waited 48 crucial hours before moving. Those 2 days had decided the fate of millions, but Garbo didn't celebrate. He couldn't. He knew the blood that soaked Normandy's beaches still flowed through his words. His lies had saved lives, yes, but they had also condemned others. And the weight of that contradiction crushed him. MI5 thanked him quietly, filed away his reports, and closed his case. The world moved on. Garbo, however, could not. The war had defined him, consumed him, and now peace felt like a punishment. He lived under assumed names in London for a while, drifting between small apartments, never staying long enough for anyone to remember his face. He was haunted not by enemies, but by his own success. Then came the paranoia. He began to suspect the Germans might discover his betrayal, that someone, somewhere, might still be hunting him. He wrote letters to MI5 asking for protection, but they went unanswered. To them, he was just another closed file, another ghost of the war. So in 1949, Garbo made his final move. He disappeared. Official records say Juan Pujol García died of malaria in Angola. A death certificate was issued, a grave was marked, and the man the world never knew quietly vanished. Only a handful of people, his British handler among them, suspected the truth. Garbo had staged his own death. He traveled through Africa under false papers, then slipped away to South America, where he began again. No medals, no missions, just another anonymous face among the heat and humidity of the Venezuelan jungles. Years turned into decades. The world changed, borders shifted, wars rose and fell, and the man who had once fooled Hitler became a ghost. In a small village outside Caracas, neighbors knew him only as José, a quiet, gentle man with a foreign accent and sad eyes. He ran a small bookstore, selling old novels and history texts, though he never spoke of the war. Sometimes, when a customer mentioned D-Day, he'd nod softly, his eyes drifting to a faraway place, as if he'd seen it all unfold from behind a curtain of lies. He had no family there, no friends who knew the truth, only memories and guilt that had hardened into something quieter, like resignation. Late at night, when the rain pounded against the tin roof of his small home, he would sit by the window, smoking in silence. He'd open an old notebook, its pages yellowed and frayed, and reread fragments of his coded messages, the ones that had once determined the fate of nations. He traced the ink with trembling fingers, as if touching the ghosts of his own creation. Sometimes he'd whisper to the empty room. It worked. But even as he said it, he didn't know if he meant it as pride or confession. Then, in 1984, nearly 40 years after he'd died, the past finally found him. A British historian, Nigel West, who had spent years researching Allied espionage, tracked him down in Venezuela. When West finally stood face to face with Garbo, the old man smiled faintly, as if he'd been expecting this moment all along. "You've been hiding a long time," West said. Garbo chuckled softly. "No," he replied, "I've just been resting." The historian recorded their meetings, capturing the extraordinary story of a man who had rewritten the course of history without ever firing a bullet. And yet, even as Garbo spoke about Operation Fortitude, the fake agents and the coded transmissions that fooled Hitler, there was a deep sadness in his voice. The kind that comes from understanding what it means to lose yourself in your own creation. He told West, "The war ended, but my lies did not. They outlived everything, even me." In the years that followed, Garbo lived quietly, refusing fame, avoiding interviews, and keeping to his small home surrounded by books and tropical silence. He didn't want recognition. He wanted forgiveness, though he never said from whom. When he died in 1988, there was no fanfare, no headlines, only a few words etched into a modest stone. Juan Pujol García, the man who saved countless lives through deception. The jungle reclaimed his house soon after, vines crawling over its walls, the same way history began to forget him again. But those who knew his story understood the strange paradox he embodied. A man who fought evil not with bullets, but with imagination. Somewhere between truth and illusion, he had found his purpose. And then, when the world no longer needed lies, he had vanished into the only peace he could find: obscurity. In the end, Garbo's greatest deception was not against Hitler or MI5, but against history itself. He erased himself, a man who had once stood at the crossroads of the world's fate. Now reduced to whispers and fading ink, the ghost in the jungle. The beaches of Normandy were quiet now. The waves that once carried death rolled gently against the shore, erasing footprints that had changed the course of the world. Somewhere beneath the grey sky, echoes of gunfire had faded into history. And yet, behind every victory, every act of courage and sacrifice, there remained an invisible thread, one spun not from steel or blood, but from words, lies, carefully crafted lies, It had begun with a whisper, a false report from a man the world had never heard of. A Spaniard with no army, no weapon, no power, only conviction. Juan Pujol García, the spy who fought not with bullets, but with deception, his false network of agents, his fabricated letters, his steady stream of misinformation. They had built the illusion that saved the Allied invasion. When German generals argued over the truth, they turned to his reports. And when Hitler hesitated, believing Normandy to be a feint and Calais the real target, he sealed the fate of the Reich. 48 hours. That was all Garbo's lies had bought. 2 days of uncertainty that changed everything. 2 days that allowed the Allies to gain ground, to push forward, to turn the tide of war. 2 days that may have saved the world, and yet Garbo lived his life in silence, without applause or recognition. No parades, no monuments, no statues in his honor. Just the quiet knowledge that his deception had shaped history more profoundly than any general's command. He had never fired a shot, never taken a life. But he had played both sides of humanity, truth and falsehood, until they became indistinguishable. To some, he was a hero. To others, a manipulator. To himself, perhaps something in between. As the years passed and the world tried to make sense of its own reflection after the war, Garbo's story became a paradox. Could a lie, born from noble intent, be righteous? Could deception ever be a form of salvation? In a world defined by propaganda and secrets, perhaps it could. Perhaps it had to be. In the quiet of his final years, Garbo once said, "The truth in wartime is like a soldier. It serves a cause, not a conscience." He had seen what men would do in the name of truth. He had seen nations crumble under it. And so he built his own weapon, one made of fiction. The world eventually learned his name. His code name, Garbo, was whispered in intelligence circles, his story written in books, his face remembered in shadows. But the man himself remained an enigma, humble, weary, and forever caught between pride and remorse. Looking back, history would call him the man who fooled Hitler. But those who truly understood knew that his real deception had been deeper. He had fooled the world into believing that lies, when wielded with conscience, could save lives, and maybe that was his legacy. A man who proved that morality in war is not black or white, but painted in shades of grey. D-Day's victory was written in the courage of soldiers and the brilliance of strategists, but also in the quiet genius of a man sitting in a Lisbon room, writing fiction so convincing it reshaped destiny. He fought his war without ever holding a gun. His battlefield was the human mind. His victory, the survival of millions. In the end, when history turns its gaze toward the great names of war, one figure stands apart, a man who lived in shadows, lied for the truth, and vanished when his work was done. He was the only man who could fool Hitler and make the world believe in the power of a lie.